The man at the bottom of the quarry road had a voice that carried like a bell, and Dara Morgann heard every word of his list, even though she stood 300 feet above him chipping slate from the cliff face. Needles, salt, mule shoes, lamp oil, writing paper, 41 books nobody up there can read, but maybe you like the pictures. She set down her chisel and wiped stone dust from her face with the back of one calloused hand. Her skin was green as spring grass, her tusks small and white against her lower lip, her build lean and hard from years splitting rock. The peddler was still shouting his wares, rattling off items with a rhythm that sounded almost like a song, and something about that rhythm made her chest feel strange. Her crew boss, a human named Tarek with a face like old leather, spat over the edge. Damned peddler. Shows up every 3 months like he owns the road. He has books, Dara said. You cannot read. I know. But she could not stop looking down at the figure below, a man with a pack mule and a cart, gesturing broadly as he called up to the village of Gracelate perched on the quarry rim. The afternoon sun caught on something metal in his cart, flashing. When the work bell rang at sundown, Dara climbed the switchback path with stone dust in her hair and her lunch pail empty. The other splitters walked ahead of her in a tight group, all human, their conversation a low mutter that cut off when she drew close. She had worked this quarry for 6 years. They still walked ahead. The village of Gracelate was 40 slate-roofed houses clinging to the cliff edge, 2 wells, 1 tavern, and a general store that sold everything at twice what it was worth, because the next town was a day's cart ride down the mountain. The peddler had set up in the square between the store and the tavern, his mule tied to the public rail, his cart half unpacked. He was younger than his voice suggested, maybe 25, with dark hair tied back and a face built for smiling. He wore a traveling coat with a dozen pockets, and he was showing a woman a packet of needles, talking fast. Sheffield steel, madam. The eyes are punched, not drilled, so the thread will not fray. My father bound books for the cathedral in Weston, and the nuns bought their needles from the same smith who made these. I would not sell you inferior goods. The woman bought the needles. Dara waited at the edge of the small crowd, watching him work. He sold salt, mule shoes, a pot of salve for chilblains, a length of ribbon. His hands moved constantly as he talked, and he remembered everyone's names after hearing them once. When the crowd thinned, he finally looked at her. His smile did not change. I have not met you before. I am Weston Norhill, and I have been working this route for 2 years, so I know I would remember. Dara Morgann. A pleasure. What can I do for you, Miss Morgann? She pointed at the books stacked in a crate at the back of his cart. They were water-stained and warped, the covers mottled. You said 41. 41 exactly. A bookbinder in Carrick went under and I bought his ruined stock for scrap. The pages are mostly readable, but the bindings are shot. I thought I might sell them for kindling, but that seemed disrespectful. He pulled one out and showed her. The cover was half torn off, but the pages inside were dense with text. This one is sermons, dull as dirt. This one is a history of the Flemish wool trade, even duller. This one is poetry. Dara took the poetry book carefully. The cover was green cloth, faded and stained. The pages were yellowed, but the text was clear, marching in neat lines down each page. She could not read a word of it. What does poetry do? Weston Norhill tilted his head. It makes you feel things. Or it makes you see things differently. Or sometimes it just sounds beautiful and that is enough. Read me some, he blinked. Right now, yes, he glanced around the square. A few villagers were still lingering, watching. He lowered his voice. People here do not like you much, do they? No. Is it going to cause me trouble if I stand here reading poetry to you? Dara met his eyes. They were brown, and they looked at her the same way they had looked at the woman who bought the needles. Probably. Well, he opened the book, flipped through a few pages, and began to read. His voice changed, became slower and rounder, shaping the words like they mattered. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high over vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils. Dara listened. The words washed over her like water, and she did not understand what half of them meant, but the sound of them made that strange feeling in her chest grow until it almost hurt. He kept reading, something about dancing daffodils and sparkling waves, and when he finished she realized she had been holding her breath. "What is a daffodil?" she asked. "A flower. Yellow grows in spring. We do not have those here." "No, I imagine Slate Country is not great for flowers." He closed the book. "Did you like it?" Dara did not have words for what she had felt. "My brother died 4 months ago. Rockfall. I have not slept a full night since. The dark is too loud." Weston's smile faded. "I am sorry. If I traded you something, would you read to me until I fell asleep?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at her. Around them the square had emptied. The sun was nearly down, and the air had the sharp, cold edge of mountain evenings. "You do not have to trade me anything." "Yes, I do." "Why?" "Because I do not take charity." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a whetstone, a good one, fine-grained and perfectly flat. "This is worth more than a ruined book." He took the whetstone, tested it with his thumb. "This is worth more than 5 ruined books. Then you will read for longer." Weston Norhill looked at her for a long moment, and then he nodded. "Where?" Dara lived in a one-room cottage at the edge of the village, built into the cliff face so that the back wall was living rock. It was cold and spare, with a slate floor and a narrow bed and a table with one chair. She lit a candle and set it on the table, then sat on the edge of the bed. Weston stood awkwardly in the doorway with the book in his hands. "You can sit in the chair," Dara said. He sat. The candlelight made his face look younger. He opened the book and began to read, and this time Dara lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, letting the words roll over her. He read about daffodils again, and then about a nightingale, and then about a ship on a cold sea. His voice was steady and warm, and for the first time in 4 months the darkness did not feel like it was pressing down on her chest. She did not remember falling asleep. When she woke, the candle had burned down to a stub and Weston Norhill was gone. The book was on the table, and next to it was a scrap of paper with writing she could not read. She folded the paper carefully and put it in her pocket, then got up and went to work. Tarek eyed her at the quarry. "You look less like death." "I slept." "Good. We need you sharp." North Face is getting unstable. The work was hard and precise, reading the grain of the stone, finding the fracture lines, driving wedges with exact force. Dara had learned it from her brother, who had learned it from their father. She was the best splitter in Grayslate, and everyone knew it, and they still made her eat lunch alone. At midday she sat on a flat rock and unwrapped her bread and cheese. One of the other splitters, a young man named Petrick, walked past and spat near her feet. "Sleeping with peddlers now, are you?" Dara looked up at him. "He read to me." "That what you are calling it?" She stood. Petrick took a step back, but his hand went to the hammer at his belt. Tarek's voice cracked across the quarry. "Break it up. We have quotas." Dara sat back down. Petrick walked away, laughing with his friends. She ate her lunch and did not taste it. The work went on. Weeks passed. The weather turned colder, and the first snow dusted the peaks above Grayslate. Dara went back to not sleeping, staring at the ceiling, listening to the dark. She thought about the sound of Weston's voice reading words she did not understand, and the way the candlelight had made the pages glow. 3 months later, she heard his voice on the quarry road again. "Needles, salt, lamp oil, mule shoes, honey from the valley. 41 books, and I have not sold a single one, so clearly I am in the wrong business. Dara set down her tools and went to the edge. Below, Weston waved up at her, grinning. She felt something in her chest unknot. At sundown she went to the square. He was selling honey this time, little clay pots sealed with wax, and the villagers were buying eagerly. When the crowd cleared, he caught her eye and held up the green poetry book. "I brought it back," he said. "I still have the whetstone." "I know." "That was a trade for one reading. This is a new offer." "What do you want?" Weston leaned against his cart. "I have been thinking. I come through here every 3 months, regular as the seasons. If you wanted, I could read to you each time I visit, no trade necessary." "Why would you do that?" "Because I like reading and you like listening, and frankly the conversation in most of these villages is dire." Dara shook her head. "I pay my way. Stubborn, are you?" "Yes," he sighed. "Fine. You can write me letters between visits." "I cannot write." "Then learn." She stared at him. "You want me to learn to write so I can pay you for reading to me. When you put it that way it sounds ridiculous, but yes." He pulled a small notebook and a pencil from one of his many pockets. "Start with your name. I will show you." They sat at the tavern table because the tavern keeper owed Weston money and did not object. Weston wrote Dara in large block letters on a page, then handed her the pencil. Her hands were built for hammers and chisels, and the pencil felt absurd between her fingers, but she copied the letters slowly. They looked like a child's scrawl compared to his, but he nodded. "Good. Now you just need to do that about 1,000 more times and you will be writing full sentences." "This is a stupid way to trade." "Probably. But you will get more out of it than I will, so I figure it is fair." That night, he read to her in her cottage again, by candlelight, and this time she fought to stay awake as long as possible, following the sound of his voice through poems about autumn and death and love and cities she would never see. He read until the candle was half gone and her eyes were slipping shut, and then he stopped mid-line. "You are asleep," he said quietly. "Not yet," Dara mumbled. "Close enough." She heard him stand, heard the soft sound of the book closing. "I will be back in 3 months. Weston." "Yes." "Thank you." There was a pause. "You are welcome, Dara." When she woke, there was another note on the table, and this time she recognized one word: Dara. She put it with the first note, folded carefully in the drawer where she kept her brother's things. The winter was hard. The quarry slowed as the stone became too cold to split cleanly, and half the crew was laid off until spring. Dara kept working because she was the best, but her wages were cut. She spent her evenings practicing letters by candlelight, copying from the few scraps of paper she could find, teaching herself to recognize words. It was slow and frustrating, and her hands cramped, but she kept at it. A letter arrived in midwinter, brought by a carter who looked at her like she might bite him. It was a single page, Weston's handwriting neat and slanted. She could read maybe one word in 5. Dara, hope, spring, books, road. She worked at it for an hour and got the gist. He was asking if she was well, telling her the roads were bad, saying he would see her in spring. She wrote back, her letters childish and crooked. "I am well. Learning to write. Sleep better when you raid." She gave it to the next carter and paid him a copper to deliver it. Spring came slowly to the mountains. The snow melted in patches, and the quarry reopened fully, and Dara went back to 12-hour days splitting slate. Her hands were scarred and strong, and she could read 50 words now, maybe more. She had borrowed a primer from the tavern keeper's daughter, who had looked at her with wide eyes and asked why an orc wanted to read. "Because I do," Dara had said, and the girl had handed over the book and not asked again. When Weston's voice echoed up the quarry road in early spring, Dara felt her heart kick. She finished her cut, cleaned her tools, and climbed down at the midday break instead of eating. He was in the square, unpacking. When he saw her, his whole face lit up. "Dara, you look good, more rested." "I have been sleeping better. Letters helping, yes." She handed him a folded page. "I wrote you this." He unfolded it carefully. His eyebrows went up as he read. "This is really good. Your spelling is perfect. I practiced. I can tell." He folded the letter and tucked it into his coat. "I brought new books. The poetry one is falling apart, so I rebound it, and I have a surprise for you." The surprise was a collection of folk tales, the pages brittle but readable. "I thought you might like stories, not just poetry," Weston said. "They are shorter, so I can read more of them in one night." That evening he read to her in her cottage, and the stories were strange and wonderful. Girls who married bears, boys who outwitted devils, a woman who spun straw into gold. Dara listened, and sometime around the fifth story she fell asleep with the sound of his voice wrapped around her like a blanket. She woke once in the night and saw him still sitting in the chair, the book open in his lap, his head tipped back against the wall, asleep. The candle had burned out. She got up quietly, took the quilt from her bed and draped it over him. He did not wake. In the morning he was embarrassed. "I am sorry, I did not mean to stay." "It is fine. I should have left." "Weston," she looked at him. "It is fine." He left after breakfast, heading down the mountain with his cart and his mule, and Dara went to work with something warm sitting under her ribs. The letters became more frequent. Weston wrote about the towns he visited, the people he met, the strange things people tried to trade for his goods. Dara wrote about the quarry, the weather, the words she was learning. Her writing got better. His letters got longer. Summer came, and so did Weston, right on schedule. This time he brought her a book as a gift, not a trade. It was a small thing, a farmer's almanac, but the pages were clean and the text was simple. "For practicing," he said. She read to him that night, stumbling over the words, and he listened with the same attention he gave to everything. When she finished a page about planting turnips, he grinned. "You are a natural. It is turnips still counts." They stayed up late talking, and he told her about his father's bookbindery in Weston, the city he was named for, and how he had left because he wanted to see the world. "Binding books is fine work, but it is the same four walls every day." "I wanted roads." "Do you regret it?" Dara asked. "No." He looked at her across the candlelight. "I have found things on the road I never would have found in a shop." She did not ask what he meant. She thought she knew. Autumn came with hard winds and early frost. The quarry pushed to meet quotas before the stone got too cold, and everyone was working double shifts. Dara was tired all the time, but she still practiced her letters, still read from the almanac, still waited for Weston's visits like they were feast days. When he arrived in the fall, the village was tense. The quarry master, a man named Herrick who lived in the valley and visited once a month to collect his profit, had announced a wage cut. The splitters were angry, but there was no other work in Grayslate. The stone was everything. Weston heard about it in the tavern. He found Dara at her cottage that evening and asked her what was happening. "Herrick says the slate market is down. He says he cannot afford to pay us the same." "Is the market down?" "I do not know. We only sell to him." Weston frowned. "That is a problem." "It is his quarry." "But you are the ones who risk your necks pulling stone out of the cliff." Dara shrugged. "That is the work." He read to her that night, but his heart was not in it, and she could tell. Halfway through a poem about harvest time, he stopped. "Dara, what would happen if you refused the wage cut?" "He would lock us out." "Could you find other work?" "Not here. We would have to leave, and most of the splitters have families, houses. This is their home." "What about you?" She was quiet for a moment. "This is my home too." He nodded slowly. "I am sorry, I should not meddle." "It is not meddling to care." He looked at her, and something in his expression made her stomach flip. "I do care," he said quietly. "More than I should, probably." Dara did not know what to say to that. She lay back on the bed and closed her eyes. "Keep raiding." He did, and she fell asleep to the sound of his voice, and in the morning he was gone again, heading south before the snow closed the high passes. The wage cut went into effect in November. The splitters grumbled but took it because there was no choice. Then in December, Herrick cut wages again. This time, the splitters refused to work. Herrick locked the quarry gates and went back to the valley. The village of Gracelate, which existed only because of the quarry, began to starve. Dara had savings, but not much. She rationed her food, made a pot of soup last 4 days. The tavern closed because nobody could afford to drink. The general store extended credit until the owner's wife put her foot down. People started talking about leaving, packing up and heading down the mountain to look for work in the valley towns. Dara thought about Weston, who would not be back until spring. She wondered if there would be a village left for him to visit. Then, in the 3rd week of the lockout, his voice echoed up the quarry road. "Anyone home up there? I have salt and lamp oil and spectacularly bad timing." Dara ran to the square. Weston was there with his cart and his mule, both of them covered in snow. He looked half frozen and completely out of place. "What are you doing here?" she said. "It is winter. The passes are closed." "Most of the passes are closed. I found one that was not." He swung down from the cart and stamped his feet, trying to get blood flowing. "I heard about the lockout from a carter in Milford. Thought I would come see if I could help." "You cannot help. There is no work and no money." "I know. That is why I brought food." He had. The cart was loaded with sacks of grain, dried beans, salted pork, hard cheese. Enough to feed the village for a month, maybe more. Dara stared at it. "This is all your stock," she said. "Yes. You will have nothing to sell." "I will restock in spring." "Weston, you cannot afford this." He looked at her, and his expression was calm and certain. "I can afford it more than you can afford to starve." The villagers came out slowly, suspicious, but when they saw the food they did not ask many questions. Weston sold it at cost, took credit, took trades for things he did not need. By nightfall the cart was empty and the village had food. Dara found him in the tavern, which had reopened now that people could pay. He was sitting by the fire, drinking soup, looking exhausted. She sat down across from him. "You are staying," she said. "Yes." "Why?" "Because you are here." It was the first time he had said it plainly, and Dara felt her breath catch. "Weston, I know. I am human, you are orc. It is complicated and probably stupid, and I do not care." He set down his soup. "I have been coming to this village for 2 years because of you. I write you letters because I want to know what you are thinking. I read you poetry because I love watching your face when you listen. I am staying because the idea of you going hungry while I am safe down in the valley makes me want to set something on fire." Dara could not speak. Around them, the tavern was warm and noisy, full of people who did not like her, in a village that had never been kind. But Weston was looking at her like she was the only person in the room. "I do not know what to do with that," she said finally. "You do not have to do anything. I just needed you to know." She reached across the table and took his hand. His fingers were cold from the road and hers were scarred from the stone, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. The lockout went on. Weston stayed. He rented a room above the tavern and set up a small bookbinding operation, repairing the damaged stock he had carried for 2 years. People brought him books, boots, harnesses, anything that needed stitching, and he fixed them for pennies. It was not his trade route, but it was something. Dara organized the splitters. It was not dramatic, just slow, practical work. Talking to each crew, listening to complaints, writing down numbers. She could write now, well enough to keep records, and she used that skill to document everything Herrick had taken from them over the years. Wages cut, safety equipment not replaced, injury payments denied. In the evenings, she and Weston worked together in her cottage. He helped her write letters to other quarries, to slate merchants, to anyone who might be willing to buy Grayslate stone if the splitters could break Herrick's monopoly. She read him her letters before sending them, stumbling over the formal language, and he suggested better words. "You are good at this," he said one night, "organizing people, making plans. I am a splitter. This is what we do. We look at a problem and find the fracture line." "Herrick is the fracture line." "Yes." The replies came slowly. Most merchants were not interested in competing with Herrick, who had deals and contracts and a reputation for nasty business. But one merchant, a woman named Caloris from a coastal city, wrote back saying she was looking for new suppliers. If Grayslate could guarantee quality and quantity, she would send a buyer in spring. It was not a solution, but it was a crack. Winter ground on. Weston's money ran out. He sold his mule, then his cart, then everything he owned except his tools and his books. The villagers, who had been suspicious of him at first, started to soften. He fixed their things, listened to their complaints, never asked for more than they could pay. He was not a hero, just a man working through a hard season, and they respected that. Dara fell in love with him somewhere in the middle of February, during a snowstorm that kept everyone inside for 3 days. They were in her cottage, and he was reading to her from a book of essays because they had read all the poetry twice, and she looked at him in the candlelight and thought, "I would do anything to keep him here." It was a terrifying thought. She had never wanted anything that much, not even when her brother was alive. When the storm cleared, she told him. They were walking to the quarry gates, where the splitters had set up a picket to make sure Herrick could not bring in replacement workers. The snow was knee-deep, and the air was so cold it hurt to breathe. Weston was talking about a letter he had received from a bookbinder in the capital, something about a new type of thread, and Dara stopped walking. "I love you," she said. He stopped talking, turned, looked at her. "What?" "I love you. I thought you should know." Weston stood very still for a moment, and then he started to laugh, not mocking, just incredulous and joyful. "You are telling me this now, in a snowbank?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because it is true." He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps and kissed her. His lips were cold and chapped, and it was the best thing Dara had ever felt. When he pulled back, he was grinning. "I love you too. I have loved you since the first time you asked me what poetry does. That was 2 years ago." "I know. I am slow." They kissed again, and the snow fell around them, and for a moment the lockout and the quarry and the whole complicated world did not matter. Spring came late, but it came. The passes opened, and Caloris's buyer arrived, a sharp-eyed man named Venn who inspected the quarry, and the village and the slate samples Dara had saved. He made an offer. It was not as good as Herrick's old rate, but it was better than the new one, and it came with a contract that included safety standards and injury pay. The splitters voted. It was not unanimous, but it was close. They would break with Herrick and sell to Caloris. Herrick came up the mountain personally to negotiate. He offered to restore the old wages, improve conditions, anything to keep the contract. But Dara stood in front of the assembled splitters and read the contract terms aloud, her voice steady, her reading perfect. When she finished, Herrick looked at her with pure hatred. "You have ruined this village," he said. "No," Dara said. "You tried to. We stopped you." He left, and the quarry reopened under new management. The splitters elected Dara as their forewoman, the first orc to hold the position. She accepted on the condition that safety standards would be written down and enforced. They agreed. Weston stayed through the spring, helping to rebuild his stock, restarting his trade route. But now Gracelate was his base, not just a stop on the circuit. He rented a small cottage near Dara's and turned it into a workshop. Between routes, he came home to her. In the summer, the village took over an empty slate shed at the edge of the quarry and turned it into a school. There were 12 children in Gracelate, and none of them could read. Dara, who had taught herself from a primer and a farmer's almanac, volunteered to teach them. The first day of school was in late summer, when the weather was warm and the slate dust hung golden in the air. The children sat on benches Weston had built, and Dara stood at the front with a slate board and chalk. She had prepared a lesson about letters, simple and practical, but when she looked at their faces, she changed her mind. "I am going to read you something," she said instead. She pulled out a piece of paper covered in her own careful handwriting. "I wrote this. It is a poem." The children looked at her with wide eyes. One of them, Petric's daughter, whispered, "Orcs do not write poetry." "This one does," Dara said. She read. The poem was about stone and hands and the way light looked on the quarry walls at dawn. It was about her brother, and the way he had taught her to hear the grain of the slate. It was about long nights and candlelight, and a voice reading words she did not understand until she did. It was not very good, technically, but it was true. And when she finished, the children were silent, then they clapped, hesitant at first, then louder. And in the back of the room, Weston was standing in the doorway, his face bright with pride. After the lesson, after the children had gone home, Dara and Weston walked to the quarry edge and looked out over the valley. The sun was setting, painting the sky red and gold. "That was beautiful," Weston said. "The poem. It was rough. It was yours." Dara leaned against him and he put his arm around her shoulders. They stood there for a long time, watching the light fade. "I have been thinking," Weston said finally, "about staying here, permanently. You love the road. I love you more." She turned to look at him. "You would give up traveling. I would adjust. I could still do short routes, come back every few weeks instead of every few months. Build a real bindery, take on apprentices. Sell books to people who are learning to read because you taught them." He paused. "If you wanted me to stay." "I want you to stay." "Good." He took a breath, and she saw that his hands were shaking. "Dara Morgann, I am not a romantic man, and I do not have much to offer except a half-ruined stock of books and a talent for talking too much. But I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life reading to you and listening to you and building something here that matters. Will you marry me?" Dara felt her throat tighten. She had never imagined this, never let herself imagine it. An orc and a human in a village that had barely learned to tolerate her. But Weston was looking at her like she was the only answer that mattered. "Yes," she said. He kissed her, and the valley spread out below them, and somewhere a night bird called. When they pulled apart, he was grinning. "I did not prepare a ring," he said. "I probably should have prepared a ring. I do not need a ring. You are going to get one anyway. I have standards." They were married in the autumn in the slate shed that was now a school. The ceremony was simple, officiated by the tavern keeper who had a legal certification from some long-ago job. Most of the village came, curious or supportive or just bored. Dara wore a dress she had sewn herself, plain green wool that matched her skin. Weston wore his traveling coat with all the pockets because it was the nicest thing he owned. When the tavern keeper asked if anyone objected, Petric stood up. Dara tensed, but Weston just looked at him calmly. "You have something to say?" Weston asked. Petric was quiet for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "No, no, I do not." He sat down. The tavern keeper pronounced them married, and Weston kissed her in front of everyone, and Dara felt something she had never felt before, like she belonged. The wedding feast was held in the tavern, and people brought food, and someone had a fiddle, and there was dancing. Dara did not know how to dance, but Weston taught her, badly, and they stumbled through a reel while people laughed and clapped. It was messy and joyful and nothing like the lonely life she had imagined for herself. Late in the evening, when the feast was winding down, Tarek approached her. He was drunk, but not too drunk to speak clearly. "You did good," he said. "With the lockout, with the school, I was wrong about you." Dara looked at him. "Yes, you were. I am sorry. All right." He nodded and walked away, and Weston squeezed her hand. "That cost him something. I know." They left the tavern as the moon rose, walking back to Dara's cottage, which was now their cottage. Weston had moved his things in over the summer, and the space that had been spare and cold was now full of books and tools, and the comfortable clutter of two lives tangling together. Inside, Dara lit a candle and set it on the table. Weston sat in the chair, the same chair he had sat in the first night he read to her, and pulled out the green poetry book. It was falling apart now, held together with new stitching and glue and stubbornness. "One more reading?" he asked. Dara lay on the bed and smiled. "Always." He opened the book and began to read, his voice steady and warm, and she listened the way she had listened that first night, like the words were a gift. But now she understood them. Now she could read them herself if she wanted, and that made them even better. He read about daffodils and nightingales, about ships and stars and the turning seasons. He read until the candle burned low and her eyes grew heavy, and when she was almost asleep, he stopped midline the way he always did. "I am not asleep yet," she mumbled. "Close enough." He closed the book and set it aside, then blew out the candle. She felt the bed shift as he lay down next to her, felt his arm come around her waist. "Weston," she said into the dark. "Yes, thank you for all of it." He kissed her shoulder. "You are welcome for all of it." They lay there in the dark, and Dara felt sleep pulling her down, warm and safe. Outside, the wind moved through the quarry, and the stars turned over Gracelate, and somewhere in the mountains a night bird sang. The years that followed were not easy, but they were good. The quarry prospered under the new contract, and Dara led the splitters with the same steady care she had learned splitting slate. The school grew, and children who would have grown up illiterate learned to read and write and think. Weston built a bindery and taught apprentices, and ran his routes, always coming home to Gracelate, always coming home to her. They had their first child 3 years after the wedding, a daughter with green skin and Weston's brown eyes and a cry that could wake the dead. They named her Sarah, and she was stubborn and clever and loved books almost as much as her father did. 2 years after Sarah came another daughter, smaller and quieter, with Dara's sharp tusks and a talent for seeing the grain in stone. They named her Kyra, and she would grow up to be a splitter like her mother. The village changed slowly. More orcs came to Gracelate, drawn by the news that there was work and fair pay and a forewoman who did not tolerate prejudice. More humans came too, looking for the same. The population grew, and the school expanded, and the general store started stocking books because Weston had created a market for them. Petric's daughter, the one who had said orcs did not write poetry, became Dara's teaching assistant. She had a gift for languages and a fierce determination, and Dara thought her brother would have liked her. On the 10th anniversary of the lockout, the village erected a small monument in the square, a piece of slate carved with the names of every splitter who had stood against Herrick. Dara's name was at the top, and below it in smaller letters. She taught us to read the stone in ourselves. Weston stood next to her at the unveiling, holding Sarah on his shoulders while Kyra clung to Dara's hand. "How does it feel?" he asked. "Strange," Dara said. "Good strange." "You deserve it. We deserve it. None of this would have happened without you." He shook his head. "I just brought books and read poetry. You did the rest. You stayed. That was everything." He smiled and kissed her, and Sarah made a disgusted noise and Kyra laughed. Around them, the village celebrated and the quarry hummed with work, and the school waited for Monday morning. That night, after the children were asleep, Dara and Weston sat in their cottage by candlelight. It was a bigger cottage now, built onto the original room with space for the girls and Weston's workshop and a real kitchen. But they still sat in the same spots, Weston in the chair, Dara on the bed, like that first night. Weston picked up the green poetry book, which was now more repair than original, and opened it. "What do you want to hear?" "Something new," Dara said. He flipped through the pages and found a poem they had not read in years, something about home and hearth and the light that guides travelers. He read it slowly, and Dara listened with her eyes closed, feeling the weight of the day and the years and the love that had built this life settle over her like a quilt. When he finished, she opened her eyes. "I wrote a new poem." "Can I hear it?" She recited it from memory. It was about a man with a voice like a bell and hands that could mend broken things. It was about candlelight and long nights and the slow work of building trust. It was about love that grew in the cracks of stone and refused to be broken. When she finished, Weston was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "That is the best thing I have ever heard. You are biased, absolutely, does not make it less true." He set the book aside and came to sit next to her on the bed. She leaned into him, and they sat there in the candlelight, listening to the sounds of their children breathing in the next room, the wind outside, the distant hum of the quarry at rest. "You ever miss the road?" Dara asked. "Sometimes. But then I come home and I remember why I stay." "Why do you stay?" He looked at her, and his expression was soft and certain. "Because you are here. Because our daughters are here. Because I would rather have this life in this village than any adventure out there." Dara kissed him, slow and sweet, and felt the truth of it settle in her bones. They had built something here, out of poetry and stone and stubborn love. It was not a grand story, not the kind bards would sing about. But it was theirs, and it was real, and it was enough. They blew out the candle and lay down together in the dark, and Dara fell asleep to the sound of Weston's breathing, and the knowledge that she was home. Outside, the stars turned over gracelate, and the quarry waited for dawn, and somewhere in the mountains the wind carried the smell of spring. The world went on, vast and complicated, but in that small cottage on the edge of the cliff, there was peace. And in the morning there would be work and children and all the small joys of a life well lived. There would be books to bind and stone to split and students to teach. There would be laughter and arguments and quiet evenings by candlelight. There would be more poems, written and read and shared. But for now, there was sleep and warmth and the certain knowledge that love, like stone, could bear any weight if you learned to read its grain. Dara dreamed of daffodils she had never seen, and in her dreams they were yellow as sunlight, growing in a field that smelled like home.